Hi, I'm John Barclay and welcome to the Fatality Free Future podcast.
My name is Holly Ferguson. This is the podcast where we explore the challenges and possibilities of creating a fatality-free future. Welcome back, John. You've been away for like a week.
Yeah, I've been on site for the last week, which has been really good, having great conversations with people. And, I think that's leaning into the subject we're going to talk about today is culture. And that, I guess that's a lot of the work we do when we go to sites is help leaders, help teams really just understand the cultural influences in what they're doing and why things become normal and, what are some of the preconceived ideas they all have. And just some of the conversations we got into, not only out in the field, but in the classroom, having a chat with people. You could really see this concept of fixed mindset versus growth mindset and people sort of seeing things as black and white. And I think trying to help people understand things are more complex than we think. And the minute you open your mind up to things are complex, you become a little bit more curious. I think when you get a bit fixed that this is the way it is, this is the way I've always done it, we start to miss opportunities to really hear what's going on and really get an understanding of what is going on when we're not there. And that sort of starts to get into the definition of what culture is about. So,
well, I'm actually interested in how you define culture. So when someone in the field says to you, John, what even is culture? What do you say?
It's a big question. There's so many definitions around. I try and keep it as simple as I can. Look, it's the way we do things around here. And then I sort of add a little bit of fun to that. It's the way we do things around here when no one's looking. Right. So when we talk about people, when we talk about the way we do things and that's then shaped by some values, that's shaped by some assumptions, and all those sorts of things coming together sort of shape up the way we act. It's really important when we talk about culture and we talk about all the attributes that come into that. It's demonstrated through action. What we see people doing gives us a visual representation of the way the culture is around here. But it doesn't paint the whole picture, right? You've actually got to go talk to people. You've got to understand what they think, what their beliefs are, what their assumptions are. What is it they perceive that the organisation and their leaders are putting value on? What's important around here? What is valued? And then that starts to shape things within the organisation. So to try and keep it pretty simple for people, culture is just the way we do things around here when no one's looking.
You mentioned talking to people there to understand how they perceive things. A lot of the time people will try and send out surveys to understand a company culture. Not to, derail this too much, but How do you feel about culture surveys?
Oh, look, they have their place. I think they help. Most of the time, the leaders I've worked with as one of their coaches, they've gotten to the point where the survey provides little to no value because they're so open to talking to their teams and listening to their teams. The survey doesn't give them anything they don't already know.
Right.
So I find surveys, and again, I'm probably going to shake a few feathers when I say this, and that's I think surveys are used because there's a lack of trust.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lack of trust to talk about things openly and honestly. So we've got to put out an anonymous survey and try and get feedback to come back so we can understand what's going on. And then my question to leaders when they lean on a culture survey is, why didn't you know that already? What's missing? Mm-hmm. Why aren't you having conversations around these things already? And one of the things that stood out to me quite a few years ago when I was coaching a leader, really, really nice guy, really passionate, he got quite nervous and had a bit of anxiety around every time the organisation was rolling out the survey because the organisation took it very seriously. If your results weren't great, there was generally a lot of follow-up from senior leaders around the culture feedback you're getting. So for him, he got quite nervous about it. And that's when I said to him, when you do these surveys, there shouldn't be any surprises for you. You should already know what's working, what's not working, what are the challenges, what's frustrating people. Now, you may not be able to resolve all of those things, right? So we've got a limited amount of resources. But if you're communicating constantly, you're listening constantly, you're working through a process of improving things constantly, the survey shouldn't give you any surprises. And it was about a year later, and it was coming to that time of year when the survey was coming out, and I could see he was quite relaxed. For me, it was the first time I'd seen him this time of year, just not even worried about it. I said, so, how are you feeling about the survey coming? Oh, fine. Yeah, I've got no problems with that. I said, so what's changed? And he goes, well, I've spent most of my time listening to the team, understanding what's happening for the team, what's missing for the team. And yeah, I spend 50-60% of my time doing that now, so I don't see there's any surprise in there. So they have their place, but I think they have their place because leaders aren't doing what they could be doing.
Now, is there such thing as a safety culture?
If you define culture as a set of common shared beliefs and a common shared values, and therefore then some normalised agreed behaviours, there's culture around everything then. I mean, there's culture's all inclusive of everything when it comes to people. It's a social thing. So you could say there's a culture around productivity, there's a culture around cost, there's a culture around quality, there's a culture around safety. Again, it's really how you put in a definition around it. And if you put in a definition around it as the way we do things around here because of a bunch of shared beliefs and a shared values, then I would say yes, there would be a safety culture because you can articulate shared beliefs around how we see safety around here and the process of safety and what we're trying to do. So there'd be some values around that, there'd be some beliefs around that, there'd be some assumptions around that, and there'd be some common day-to-day behaviours related around that.
I suppose because you could have a team that's really jovial, they really get along with each other, but then they might be doing really unsafe work constantly. You might think, oh, well, we've got a really good culture because we're all friends. But then the work isn't quite lining up with a great safety culture.
Yeah, and I think this is the challenge in this conversation, right, is people think the culture is all about just how people get along and how people feel. That's a part of it. But again, it depends on what it is you're trying to shape with culture. The other part that's really challenging in this space is, there's stuff going on at work that we've spoken about as cultural, but there's outside norms that are cultural as well, right? So if you've got a high diverse workforce, you've got a whole bunch of other worldviews coming into that space. And that can change things around. So we can put all our effort into everyone getting along and feeling included and having really good camaraderie together and things, but that necessarily hasn't had the same focus or attention to drive a certain level of beliefs around how we do our work and how we do our work safely and how we do those processes safely. So yes, I believe there is a distinction between different things because I believe culture is about shared beliefs and shared values and some common assumptions, and that can fit in anywhere.
Let's talk about SIF prevention and how does culture fit into that?
Yeah, so I mean, SIF prevention, as we've been talking about, is really focusing in on those things that have the potential for serious injuries and fatalities. Now, I guess the challenge we've been talking about with some of those things is they're low frequency, high consequence, right? So without careful consideration and thinking about the shared values and the shared beliefs and the underlying assumptions, if we're not deliberately trying to shape those and maintain those around focusing on things that can kill us, we run the risk of people not paying attention to those things because they don't happen very often, but we're exposed to them frequently. So culture is critical in this space because it is shaping, so, and we'll use terms such as risk perception, right? So it shapes people's risk perception to actually understand these things I'm doing all day, every day that have the potential for a fatality are really important, even though nothing bad's ever happened. That's the bit for me where culture fits in here. It's really just maintaining an essence of focus and an essence of actually understanding that these things that we do every day are really, really important.
Do you have any examples that you want to give us?
Let me just go to driving. I think that's probably the most common thing everyone can connect to, whether you're at work or not, right? So depending on what work you do, I think everyone would have an association with driving or being around vehicles. Have a look around the world. Everyone's driving, and the way we commute is different all around the world. And that's just a common shared norms, right? Shared beliefs and values and assumptions, and therefore then behaviours. So in Australia, for example, it's highly regulated. There's lots of controls. There's lots of processes in place to try and get drivers to follow a set process. If you weren't paying attention to the cultural aspect, there is some underlying standards to that, right? There are some underlying rules that aren't written in driving tests and processes, right? So, the way you work through an intersection in Australia is very described, right? You give way, stop signs, give ways, all those sorts of things. There's structures around how we govern the way we work, and that's built cultures. That's sort of built people's beliefs around those things. But then you go to some other countries, and while there's stop signs and give way signs are there, there's sort of little unwritten rules around when you do give way and when you don't. And, people are driving through intersections without stopping because they're on a motorbike, and that's okay because motorbikes get the right of way. But then you look about how people cross roads. You can sort of see in different cities, even when I go around all the different cities in Australia, the amount of people crossing the road, not at intersections with lights to manage traffic, changes in every sort of city and every, even here in Perth where we are. If you look at the Perth side versus the Northbridge side, you get a real sense of how things change because of the cultural side of things, of why I'm there and what I'm doing, and the sort of shared values and beliefs that sit on one side of the railway line versus the other. So, those are what we mean. They're all high risk. We're driving. There's a risk of serious injury and fatalities when driving and interacting with pedestrians. But we get some norms around them that just expose us to those. And you hear people say, I'm an adult, I can cross the road. I don't need a red light, green light. I don't need a pedestrian crosswalk. What you actually start to see there is we get a normalisation until you almost get hit by a car. And then you change that. You probably do use the crosswalk for a while, and you probably do use the red light, green light process. And then, all of a sudden you start to get back into your normal habits of crossing the road anywhere you like. So those things come through. And then you've got things like working at height. For those who are familiar with working at height, people can become comfortable working at height because, like anything, some people grew up climbing trees and they're really comfortable with the level of height and taking that risk, and don't necessarily put as much value on wearing a harness and being hooked up all the time because they have a lot of confidence that they can do the work and be careful. So you start to see those cultural things shift all the time, and that's what we're challenged with. That's why culture becomes so important in the way we try and manage our serious injuries and fatalities, because those are low frequency, high consequence events, and because they're low frequency, we can get normalised.
Would you describe all of those sort of exceptions we make as bad habits?
Yeah, look, we tend to label things as good and bad, safe and unsafe. The habits, they're just the way we go about doing things. And we talk about this with people when we're on site is, it's just understanding the normal, what's normal. We can talk about those as habits, whatever descriptor you want to use, right? But that's just what's become normal around here. And therefore then, is that helpful? Is that actually helping us minimise risk and minimise harm? Or is it unhelpful? Is it actually leaving us exposed? Is actually increasing our exposure? So I think it just really depends. And I think this is something I've learned over the last few years is when we label things as good and bad, right or wrong, those sorts of things, we run the risk of falling back into fixed mindset of don't do that, do this, and not stay curious around, well, okay, we're doing it this way, and what does that mean? What does it mean? Is it actually better than what I thought?
If you could describe one of the most important things about culture, what would that be?
All of this cultural work only gives us the opportunity to really understand it when there's trust. If people don't feel like we trust them and they can trust us to talk to us openly and honestly, and we can talk about work and people aren't going to get blamed and people aren't going to get ridiculed for doing it right or doing it wrong. If we don't have trust, a lot of this really becomes difficult. I was saying before with the surveys, if there's not a lot of trust, we tend to default to it on surveys to give us feedback because we know we're not getting real feedback. And that onus sits on us as leaders. Anyone that's in a leadership role, if you're having to lean on surveys to get feedback because you aren't feeling like you're getting honest feedback, that's up to you to change that.
So would you say that shaping a culture sits with the leader?
Culture gets shaped from everyone. But I think leaders have a unique role in that they provide the context for what we're focusing on. They're providing the context for how we're expected to do work and how we're expected to do things in the workplace. So I talk about that, and a lot of people describe it as, well, as leaders, we cast a shadow, right? So we cast a shadow where people either trust us or don't trust us. We cast a shadow that helps people understand that doing work safely is very important to us, and understanding how work's being done and wanting to improve the way we do work is also really important to us. So we cast a shadow, and if your shadow is making people feel uncertain, even to the extent of being fearful, you're not going to get really good honest feedback. Like, you can go out and try and influence the culture as much as you like. You're going to really struggle with it because people aren't going to open up with you and be honest with you and talk about how they're experiencing work in a way that helps you shape it and helps you adjust it, because culture's ever evolving. So if you're not able to cast the right shadow, then you're going to find it really difficult. And you hear leaders say all the time, well, I've told them that 1,000 times. Yeah, that's okay. Well, that's not working. So you might need to find a different way to influence the way work's being done in a different shadow, because the shadow you're casting at the moment isn't helping.
Yeah, and this is a conversation I know that you have a lot with leaders. So what is the advice you generally give them about their shadow? Pause
and reflect. Really think about what is it you're trying to do. And, well, let me even step that back a bit. What is the culture you want? I mean, what's really important? What is it you're trying to shape? Spending time on those, not having I think this is the other problem leaders do. They have a big list of things that are really important. Like when I ask leaders what's really important, and they write down all these adjectives, and there's like 20 or 30 of them, and I'm just, okay, let's try and wrap this up into a couple of attributes that are just really important that's going to shape some of that. So I think it's focusing in on what you can get your arms around and what you can practice day in and day out. Probably the next major thing is really just creating a reflective routine. So reflecting on work, which means probably listening to people, reflecting on your own behaviours, reflecting on your own successes and challenges, things you did well, things you missed, just encouraging that. The interesting one I use, and I find it really interesting how often it gets picked up when I'm out in the field coaching leaders. When you're reflecting, don't just reflect on what you said and what you did. Actually reflect on how you think people now feel now that you've walked away. Now, I know that's hard to answer, right? Because we don't always know how people feel, but at least start thinking about how you leave people and how you leave them feeling after you've had a conversation with them. And people will start to say to me, oh, if I actually think about that, I think they're probably going to feel a bit beaten up because I just pointed out all the things they're doing wrong. Okay, so if you think they're going to be feeling a bit beaten up, what's that going to do to the culture? Versus others will say, well, I had a really good conversation. I heard lots of new things and they opened up and they were sharing lots of, so I would think they feel pretty good about that conversation. And I'm like, okay, cool. And what do you think that's doing to the culture? So I think that's probably the biggest thing for me is know exactly what it is you're trying to achieve, practice it, reflect on it, but also reflect on how you're impacting people. Like start to think about how you might be impacting people.
That's great advice for people who are in the field and get to have those interactions on the day-to-day. What about the people who are maybe in the senior positions who don't get to speak to the people in the field or wherever the work is being done on that daily basis?
Yeah, so I think it comes again to the conversations you're having with your direct reports. And I think if you're not asking questions about what they're learning about work and what are they hearing from their teams and what sort of things are they focusing on, and if you're just really focused on data, results, metrics, action plans, if it's very transactional in nature, then just understand that's the shadow you're casting from a very senior level, that's a very transactional orientated relationship with people. How do you respond when things aren't going well? So the data you're getting isn't the data you hope to get, like your KPIs aren't being met. How are you responding or reacting to that? Because again, that's going to show your direct reports how they think they should be responding in this workplace when things aren't going right. Yes, you may not be out in the field day in and day out with the teams at the pointy end of the work, but you're shaping your leaders, the leaders that report to you, you're shaping their perceptions and their values and their beliefs and their assumptions around what's expected of them when they go and spend times with their team. So for me, every level of leaders, every level of role, anyone can be a leader. Just because you're in a position of authority doesn't make you a leader. Leadership's a behaviour, but there's an implied accountability to lead when you're in those roles. So the more senior you are, just understand you have a big shadow cast across a lot of people and you influence a lot of other shadows. So really think about how you want to shape the leadership behaviour or the leadership culture that's now going to go out and cascade. Touching on leadership behaviour is very good because we're going to be talking about leadership in the next episode. Yeah, and we'll pick it up then. See you in the next one.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatality Free Future podcast. Head to our Fatality Free Future hub on barclays.com for more information and to access everything we spoke about in this episode.